The wind had teeth that morning, sharp and insistent, scraping across the open water and rattling every loose fitting on her boat. Low clouds pressed down on the horizon, turning the sea a dull steel color, the kind that made distances hard to judge and intentions harder. Her vessel moved steadily through the chop, engine humming with a disciplined rhythm that matched her breathing. It wasn't new, and it wasn't pretty, but every bolt, every weld, every scar on the hull had a purpose. She stood at the helm with relaxed posture, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the throttle, eyes constantly sweeping the water, not nervously, but methodically, like someone trained to notice what others missed. She spotted the Coast Guard cutter before she heard it, a faint white line against the darker water, approaching at an angle that wasn't accidental. Seconds later, the siren cut through the wind, sharp and commanding, blue lights flashing even though daylight made them unnecessary. She didn't flinch. Instead, she eased off the throttle just enough to signal compliance, her movements unhurried and precise. Panic was something she'd trained out of herself a long time ago. The loudspeaker barked orders: identify yourself, prepare to be boarded, maintain current heading. She acknowledged with a brief radio response, voice calm, neutral, almost bored. On the cutter's deck, she could see two officers watching her closely. One was young, broad-shouldered, his stance stiff with the confidence of someone still proving himself. The other was older, seasoned, his posture looser but eyes sharper, already cataloging details. The reinforced railings, the unusual spacing of the cleats, the way the boat sat in the water slightly heavier than expected. As the cutter came alongside, waves slapped hard between the hulls, sending up bursts of cold spray. The younger officer made the jump first, landing solidly on her deck. His boots echoed against metal that was thicker than standard. He glanced down, just for a fraction of a second, registering that detail even if he didn't yet understand its significance. The older officer followed more carefully, one hand steadying himself on a rail that didn't flex under his grip. "Morning," the older one said, professional but firm. "We're conducting a routine inspection. There have been reports of unregistered modifications and unauthorized activity in this area." "Understood," she replied, meeting his eyes without challenge or apology. Her face was weathered but composed, expression unreadable in the way that came from years of controlling reactions. "What do you need? Registration, logs, proof of insurance?" She nodded once and turned toward the cabin. As she descended the steps, the younger officer took a slow look around the deck. The nets were neatly coiled, not tossed. The storage lockers were sealed tight, hinges heavy-duty. Even the way tools were mounted, secured, evenly spaced, spoke of habit rather than hobby. This wasn't the deck of a careless smuggler or a sloppy fisherman. It was efficient, intentional. Below deck, she opened a steel-lined compartment that blended almost invisibly into the bulkhead. From inside, she retrieved a worn folder, edges soft from years of handling. When she came back up, she handed it over without ceremony. The older officer flipped through the papers, eyes scanning quickly. Everything appeared in order, if a bit old. The younger officer leaned in, helping verify dates and numbers. That's when he noticed it, tucked behind the insurance documents, a laminated card that didn't match the rest. It wasn't flashy, no dramatic colors, just an insignia, a photo, and text so understated it almost felt heavier for it. He slid it out, brows knitting as he read. Once, then again, slower. His throat tightened. He didn't say anything, he just passed it to his superior. The older officer's reaction was subtler but no less profound. His fingers paused on the card, grip adjusting unconsciously as his eyes locked onto the emblem. The wind seemed louder suddenly, the rocking of the boat more noticeable. For a long moment, no one spoke. She watched them, perfectly still, already knowing what they were seeing and what it would do to the conversation. The older officer finally looked up at her, the authority in his voice recalibrated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "can you explain the structural reinforcements on this vessel?" She met his gaze evenly. "Operational requirements. Details aren't in the log." The younger officer swallowed, eyes flicking from her face to the card and back again. The sea continued to roll around them, indifferent, as the balance of power shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, on the deck of that unassuming boat. The older officer cleared his throat, the sound oddly formal against the constant rush of wind and water. He handed the laminated card back to the younger officer, who returned it to her with both hands, as if it were something fragile or sacred. She slid it into the folder and tucked the folder under her arm, her movements unshowy but deliberate. The siren from the cutter remained off now, and the blue lights had stopped flashing, leaving the scene stripped down to its essentials: 3 people, 2 boats, and the open sea. "Mind if we take a closer look below deck?" the older officer asked. It was phrased as a request, not an order. She considered him for a brief second, then nodded. "Go ahead." The younger officer descended the steps first, ducking slightly as he entered the cabin. Inside, the air smelled faintly of oil and salt, clean but lived in. There was no clutter. Every surface had been cleared or secured. Bunks were narrow, utilitarian. Storage compartments were labeled in neat, block lettering. He ran his hand along a bulkhead and felt the thickness immediately: reinforced steel behind marine-grade paneling. This wasn't something slapped together in a backyard workshop. The older officer followed, slower, eyes taking in everything at once. He noticed the secondary navigation system mounted discreetly beneath the primary console, the kind designed to function independently if the main system failed. He noticed the medical kit, compact but advanced, secured within arm's reach. Trauma shears, tourniquets, vacuum-sealed bandages, not recreational gear. "You spend a lot of time offshore?" he asked, voice casual but probing. "Enough," she replied from the doorway, not hovering, not defensive. "Just present." The younger officer opened a locker and found dive equipment packed with military efficiency. Another locker revealed dry suits, folded with precision. No contraband, no weapons, but the absence itself spoke volumes. This boat wasn't designed for crime. It was designed for contingencies. Back on deck, the cutter radio crackled. A voice came through, asking for a status update. The older officer hesitated before responding, eyes still on her boat, her posture, the way she stood balanced without bracing despite the chop. "Inspection ongoing," he said finally. "Stand by." He clipped the radio back to his vest and turned to her. "Your logs show irregular routes. Long arcs, wide turns. You're not fishing." She didn't argue. "No. Transport, sometimes." The younger officer stiffened slightly, instinctively reaching for procedure. The older officer raised a hand, subtle but firm, stopping him. "Humanitarian?" the older officer asked. She met his gaze again. "When needed." That was all she offered, and somehow it was enough. The older officer exhaled slowly, a sound lost almost. Immediately to the wind. He had spent years enforcing maritime law, learning to spot lies, learning when to push and when pushing would only create more trouble than it solved. He had also learned to recognize people operating in a different lane entirely, parallel to the rules, not above them, not beneath them, but adjacent. The younger officer looked unsettled, caught between training and intuition. "Sir," he said quietly, "shouldn't we at least?" "We've seen what we need to see," the older officer interrupted, not unkindly. He turned back to her. "There have been seizures in this sector. Smugglers using modified hulls, false transponders. That's why we stopped you." "I figured," she said. No bitterness, no pride. There was a long pause, filled only by the slap of waves against steel. The cutter drifted slightly closer, its crew watching from a distance, sensing the shift without understanding it. The older officer straightened. "Everything checks out," he said at last. "You're free to go." The younger officer blinked. "Sir, I'll note the inspection," the older officer continued, voice final. "No violations." She inclined her head in acknowledgement, a gesture so slight it could have been missed. "Appreciate the professionalism." As the officers stepped back toward their cutter, the younger one glanced over his shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, hesitating, "stay safe out here." She allowed herself the smallest smile, barely there. "Always do." The lines were cast off. The cutter's engine roared to life, turning away, its presence already receding. She returned to the helm, hand settling on the wheel like it belonged there, because it did. As she advanced the throttle, the boat surged forward, slicing cleanly through the gray water. Behind her, the Coast Guard vessel watched for a moment longer than necessary before resuming its patrol, carrying with it the quiet weight of an encounter that would linger long after the sea erased all visible traces. The sea opened up ahead of her as the Coast Guard cutter faded into the gray distance, its wake dissolving quickly into the restless water. She kept her course steady for several minutes, not out of caution but habit. Years of experience had taught her that real danger often came after the obvious threat passed. Only when the patrol boat was a pale smudge on the horizon did she allow herself to shift her stance, rolling her shoulders once, loosening muscles that had been ready for far worse than a paperwork inspection. She reached down and adjusted a switch near the helm. A secondary system hummed alive, quiet and efficient, feeding her a cleaner picture of the surrounding waters. The reinforced hull met each wave with confidence, cutting rather than slamming, a design choice born from nights she preferred not to remember. Her eyes flicked to the compass, then to the horizon, calculating without conscious thought. Whatever she'd been heading toward before the interruption was still there, still waiting. Below deck, a secure compartment clicked open as the boat steadied. Inside, carefully sealed crates were lashed tight, not weapons, not contraband, but supplies that didn't show up on tourist brochures. Medical gear, water purification units, emergency rations, the kind of cargo that mattered only when things had already gone wrong. She checked the seals, satisfied, then closed the compartment and locked it with a code she never reused. The encounter replayed itself in her mind, not emotionally but analytically. The younger officer's posture, the older one's pause before speaking into the radio. The moment authority had shifted without anyone saying it out loud. She respected that. Not everyone did. Some uniforms came with egos too loud to hear common sense. Those encounters usually ended messier. A gust of wind tore spray across the bow, cold and sharp. She welcomed it. The sea had always been honest with her. It didn't care who she was or what she'd done. It only responded to skill, preparation, and respect. She had learned those lessons early, learned them well, and paid for them in ways that didn't show on the surface. Her radio crackled softly, encrypted, low power. A brief transmission came through, nothing more than coordinates and a time window. She acknowledged with a single click and adjusted her heading by a few degrees. Somewhere ahead, someone was counting on her boat arriving quietly, without questions, without flags. The Coast Guard stop had been a delay, not a derailment. As the hours passed, the light shifted, clouds thinning just enough to let pale sun spill across the water. The world felt wider out here, stripped of noise and explanations. She moved with the boat, every sound familiar, the engine note, the rattle of chains, the subtle change in vibration when the current shifted. This was where she made sense. Not in briefings or ceremonies or stories told secondhand, but here, between sky and water, doing work that didn't ask for recognition. She allowed herself a small, private thought of amusement. Somewhere back on that cutter, two officers would be finishing their report, choosing words carefully, leaving things unsaid. The younger one would probably tell the story later, lowering his voice at the right moment. The older one would listen more than he spoke. Neither would ever forget the way a simple laminated card had changed everything. The sun dipped lower, painting the waves with streaks of silver and dull gold. She checked the time, then the fuel, then the horizon again. Everything was on schedule. Whatever waited ahead, she was ready for it. She always was. The boat pressed forward, steady and unremarkable to anyone watching from afar. Just another vessel on an endless sea. And that was exactly how she liked it. If you enjoyed this story and want more intense, emotional, and powerful scenes like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel Her Stories Words and stay with us for the next unforgettable story.